An intellectual error that I see a lot of, let's just say, so-called skeptics do when they're talking about witness testimony is they emphasize how unreliable it is, but at the expense of recognizing that it's not always unreliable. So they characterize it in an incredibly unbalanced way that I perceive as disingenuous. We could do a scientific experiment in this regard. We could get a couple Top Gun pilots, have them do some sorties, and then have them encounter planes of all different kinds. And when they land, we could give them a test and see how accurate they are in their assessment of what planes they crossed paths with while they were flying their planes. This excessive take on the unreliability of witness testimony reminds me of the early days of mixed martial arts, when people of all various martial art backgrounds would enter competitions, but it quickly became readily apparent that not every martial art translated well to combat. One that notably translated really well to combat was jiu-jitsu. And so in this same light, I view world institutions decrying witness testimony to the extent they do, just like the guy who has a martial art he's in love with, but when he enters the MMA competitions, it simply doesn't work when he goes up against someone who's well-trained at Muay Thai and jiu-jitsu. The purpose of my argument is not to prove that witness testimony can establish that some UFOs are extraordinary technology. No, my argument is much more nuanced than that. It's that with enough witness testimony over enough years, you have to start taking this UFO phenomena really seriously. Just look at the Rua, Zimbabwe case with all those elementary school children. You can't just rely on, well, they probably misidentified it because witness testimony is so bad. That's intellectually bankrupt. You got to start realistically getting suspicious that maybe there is something to this UFO phenomena, and that should trigger world institutions to take a very sober, pragmatic, and long-term look into it. Now I want to go back to the Rua, Zimbabwe 1994 UFO case, where allegedly flying saucers landed and gray, scrawny, short beings exited those vehicles, and the school children saw all of this take place and even received telepathic messages from the beings themselves. Now, according to James Fox, it was around 100 witnesses, but only 60 children came forward. And there was also a teacher who came forward who explained that she witnessed the same thing. And children don't have preconceived notions, and the children have not changed their stories. If you've watched the movie The Phenomenon, James Fox is able to interview some of those children many decades later, and they're still as adamant as they were when they were children that they saw what they saw. Now, this is a microcosm of a macrocosm. If you look at the UFO historical record, you have so many cases, many of them corroborated, similar patterns threaded throughout the historical record. You have other school landings with very similar patterns as what took place at Rua, Zimbabwe. And yet the world is not on fire to figure out what's going on. And I take issue with that. And I find it to be literally insane in the final analysis. Another notable UFO encounter that James Fox depicted in his film comes from the year 1955. Colonel William Coleman, decorated World War II veteran, pilot. He took off from Miami in a B-25 bomber because he was transporting it to a base in Mississippi. During that voyage, at one point, he sees a perfectly round shadow, and he's at treetop level. So he's very close to the ground, which only assists his capability to discern what he's seeing. So he makes a maneuver to get and overtakes it so he can get a look at what's casting that shadow, and he testifies that he saw a perfectly shaped flying saucer, metallic, no rivet lines, no obvious source of propulsion, no exhaust, just a perfect flying saucer. And this is in broad daylight. And so this by itself would not necessarily be significant. But again, just like the Rua, Zimbabwe case and the many, many school landings that have been recorded, alleged school landings, within the UFO historical record, these kinds of sightings have happened over and over and over again. And if you listen to what Commander David Fravor has to say, what he testifies along with the other aviators that were present in the air at the time, they give the same sort of description regarding the capabilities of these machines. And there's a very regular pattern about how these machines look. Sometimes they're triangular. Sometimes they're in the shape of saucers. Other times they're in the shapes of cigars. But these are the general shapes people see over and over again, and the capabilities and characteristics are acknowledged over and over again as having the same bizarre flight characteristics. So I consider it extremely lazy, and I hear a lot of intellectuals do this, and I just think it's extremely lazy to simply walk away from the responsibility to figure out what's going on the basis that, well, everybody, witness testimony is not very reliable. And I know the rebuttal of what some of my beautiful audience is going to say. They're going to say, wait a minute, sir. In the beginning of your video, you said that many so-called skeptics are unbalanced with their characterization of witness testimony, because whenever the subject of UFOs enters the discussion, they emphasize to a fault that witness testimony is unreliable. But aren't you just doing the same, but the converse? That is, you're giving the impression it's very reliable, and you're not giving ample attention to how unreliable it is. And that's a fair argument. And my response to that would be, I'm glad you stated a fair argument. I love fair arguments. But here's the problem with that. Even if I'm doing that, there are so many corroborated cases going back 70 plus years. In addition, many of those cases have radar operators who are willing to testify under oath that they recorded the data and it's later become classified. And I would also say that there's a big distinction between a single person that sees something and an event that's more highly corroborated, where you have multiple people saying they saw the same thing. And indeed, that would apply to the case that happened in 1955 that I just talked about with William Coleman. He wasn't the only person on that plane. The other people saw what he saw. So this is very nuanced and complex, isn't it? Right? There are different cases, and some cases are more compelling than others. But at the end of the day, you would only need one rendition to be accurate for the whole paradigm to shift. You would only literally need one set of eyes that accurately saw what they say they saw in terms of a technological object, for example, doing a fast 90-degree turn, which we can't do, but maybe something else can do. So essentially, my perspective is this. I would argue, and this is just my opinion, that contrary to the skeptical inclination, I would actually argue that people would be surprised if there was some way to validate it. People would be surprised how many UFO cases going back 70 plus years have been depicted more or less accurately. That's my opinion. Whereas the skeptic would be inclined to say, not that most of them are wrong, but that all of them are wrong, because they have no other choice. Because if just one of them is correct, well, then the paradigm shifts, and then we have a true mystery on our hands. But the skeptics doesn't do that generally. Many of them don't. They take a path which I consider extremist, right? I consider it an extremist position to dive into the UFO historical record and come away with the assessment that every single person, no matter how corroborated it is, independent of that, got it wrong. That is intellectually laughable. So my basic premise is that we should all be suspicious at the very minimum that something is going on. It doesn't have to be conviction. It doesn't have to be binary. It doesn't have to be you either believe it or you don't. It could be something more nuanced than that. It could be, you know what? I don't 100% believe it, and I don't 100% disbelieve it, but there's been enough corroborated UFO events going back 70 plus years. There's been enough documents that have been acquired through Freedom of Information Act that display people within government taking this seriously, that being 100% certain it's all nonsense is inappropriate. And I actually believe, and I'll probably make some people angry, that being 100% certain that there is something going on is also inappropriate. That is actually my position. I think there's a spectrum of reasonable interpretation when it comes to UFO reality. There's a spectrum of reasonable. And people on either side of the extremes, from my vantage point, ultimately, maybe, are ideologues. They're reading out of a script, right? They're giving you talking points. They're not really thinking. And I see that a lot. I see that on Twitter. People aren't actually thinking for themselves. They're just parroting what other people say because it sounds smart. You can call me cynical all you want. I'm a cynical SOB sometimes, baby. You better believe you don't like it, you can unsubscribe. You can unsubscribe if this irritates you. But that's how I feel. Now, I have no choice but to underscore an exception to my general perspective on this. And that is people who've had unambiguous sightings of UFOs. I don't know if it's really rational to say that they should be expected not to be 100% that this is real. Now, if I had that experience, would I be 100%? Not necessarily. But I would not necessarily feel comfortable saying someone that saw a flying saucer at close proximity in a completely unambiguous way is being unreasonable if they feel that there's a 100% probability that this phenomena exists. In that same vein, let's look at a guy like Luis Elizondo. He's seen stuff we haven't seen, and he's seen it under controlled circumstances. All the more so, someone like that should be, in my opinion, convinced that this is real. I'll see you in the next episode.